Greetings YouTube, this is the follow-up video to my review of the Ultimate Equipment Guide for Pathfinder from Paizo Publishing. Here is the book in question. Now, this is where I talk about the bad stuff, the things that I didn't like, and in particular, I'm talking about the illustrations in the weapon section. Now, people are going to say that I'm being obsessive-compulsive and I'm being pedantic, and you may be correct. But this reference guide here may be the only exposure that many gamers have to what the weapons look like in their games. I've got a library of reference books. I've sketched hundreds of weapons. Go check out my DeviantArt if you'd like to take a look at them. I will probably put a link below if I remember to do so. I probably will not going to be posting this video today, however. So the illustrations in this book are important. They need to look like the items that they are describing. So, the first one I encountered that made no sense to me was the bill. Now, a bill is a polearm weapon. Now, many polearm weapons, I would argue almost all polearm weapons, except for maybe the spear, were derived from farming implements, particularly in Europe and in Asia. Now, it was very much because peasants weren't allowed to have proper weapons. And so they developed weapons based on the items they had at hand, which then become militarized over time and then became proper weapons in their own right. The flail started out as a grain threshing device, as did the nunchucks. All right, that's how the weapons evolved. They were tools; they became weapons. The bill is a pruning hook, so it's a blade that looks like this that you use to cut branches, cut down fruit, prune trees. So a bill hook is useful because it's a blade on a hook and you put it on a 6 or 7 foot shaft, and now it becomes a polearm. Over time, many people then took the hook and the hook remained, but they put a little spiky bit on it, so not only could you reach up and hook something, but you could stab it with it as well, making it more versatile. And frequently, they put a spike on the back so that you could make a back spike hit with it for penetrating armor. So that's how the bill hook or the bill eventually evolved into a weapon. All right. The illustration they have here under bill is a halberd. It's not sort of a halberd. It's not close to a halberd. It's not some fusion of halberd and bill. The illustration they have in this for the bill is a halberd. Why did you do that? It makes no sense. Okay, next thing we have here is the boomerang. Now, they describe the boomerang properly. A combat or hunting boomerang is asymmetrical. It does not return. It's an aerodynamic throwing stick that can be deadly. Some of the hunting versions still had an aerodynamic flight in the sense that they would fly along the ground and then they would arc up. They were used for hunting birds. You'd throw them, they would spook a flock of birds from the ground, the birds would fly up, and you might hit 1 or 2 birds in the process. The ones used for combat were heavier, shorter range, but they were deadly, and they did not return. That's correct. The description, no problem. The picture that they use for it is a lightweight returning boomerang. You just described something that is not in the picture. Why did you do that? Alrighty. Next one in here. Okay, when we get to the composite bow and the composite longbow and shortbow, it was okay. They're a little more stylistic than I think maybe that you need, but it is a fantasy game. I cut up some slack on that one. Sorry, I'm just kind of. Where was the next one I wanted to whine about? And I freely admit this is pedantic. Okay, the glaive in here was okay. It was not quite as curved as I think most glaives would be. Glaives tended to have some kind of curve to the blade, but they weren't too bad. The great club is essentially a log, but great clubs or two-handed combat clubs could be elegant. Go look into what some of the things that the Polynesians and the North American Native Americans did out of this. They're beautiful. They're works of art. and they're two-handed weapons. So I think that they did a disservice by not emphasizing that. Then they have the greatsword in here, which is, the blade is way too wide, and the handle is way too short for this illustration. A greatsword does not look like this. I realize it's a fantasy game, but the device they show here is essentially useless. You could not wield it, and so I think that was a little that was kind of a bad choice on their part. Then we get into the halberd. Now the halberd illustration is correct. It's the same illustration they used in the bill. They just rotated it 180 degrees. That's it. They used the same illustration. I guess it saved them some time, which is nice, I guess. But I don't know. And they have the hooked lance. Hooked lance is a pretty good example of a bill hook. Not to mention I've never heard of a hooked lance. Now here's one of the things. There's something in here called a hungamunga. I'm actually going to show you the illustration. It's a weird weapon. It's right here. Okay. Now the hungamunga is an unusual African throwing weapon. They got it right. That's perfect. So they got that right. Something obscure and strange that most people have never heard of, have never seen an illustration of, and yet they couldn't get bill hook right? There's an inconsistency here that makes no sense to me. The iron brush, excellent job. The karambit, the jute. These are items that are unusual, the khopesh, and yet they got them correct. A number of the Asian style weapons in here, again, they're unusual in design and such, and yet they nailed them. And yet an item which is dirt common in European armies was gotten wrong. Then they go into the longbow. Now the longbow is a self bow, and the illustration here has the bow doing the kind of the classic recurve. Longbows aren't recurves; they have one arc. That's it. They're incredibly hard to make because you have to pick the grain of the wood that actually gives you all of the characteristics of compression and expansion that you need. That's why making a composite bow, while still an incredibly complex device, don't get me wrong, you can pick the items that do everything you want them to do and then put them together in the way you want to put them together. It doesn't make the item any less complex, but it means that at least your components that go into it can be chosen for their particular characteristic, as opposed to a longbow, which you have to find a piece of wood that meets all of the characteristics you want, which is more difficult to do in my opinion. The Lucian hammer, again, a somewhat unusual polearm, and they got that correct. The Madao, man-catcher, monk's spade, these are things they all got right. Now the Morning Star illustration looks like someone gave, they handed the artist a verbal description of what a Morning Star was, and then he drew a picture based on that verbal description, having never seen one. You could go online right now and type in Morning Star, and you will have access to hundreds of images of what a Morning Star looks like, and there's all kinds of varieties out there. This thing does not look like what I imagine a Morning Star is supposed to look like. This thing looks like a club, and I find that weird. Naginata, they nailed it. 9 weapons whip, the 9-section whip, again, an obscure weapon, they got it right. Now they have something in here called an ogre hook. It's a fantasy weapon. There's nothing to compare it to. So at least in that regard, when they were dealing with complete fantasy items, they can't get them right or wrong because they're inventing them. So at least that's a really safe thing. The next thing is the pilum. Now here's the pilum picture. Oops, let me get there in that. Where am I going? Oh yeah, here you go, right there, pilum. Okay, it's a spear right in the middle of the screen, right next to my eye. Okay, a pilum is a throwing spear. It doesn't look like this. A pilum was a weapon designed to break after you threw it. It was designed to pin your opponent's shield and make it useless. Earlier ones, the shafts would actually bend because half the weapon was metal and half the shaft was wood. Later versions had wooden pins that would break, so you'd throw it, the shock would snap the wooden pin, the shaft would kind of flop onto the ground. You couldn't pick it up and throw it back at you, and most likely it was stuck in their shield, making their shield useless, making it easier to kill them. And at the end of the battle, if you were alive, you could then take the pylon, repair it, and use it again. That is not what a pylon looks like. We know what they look like. They've been in hundreds of illustrations. There are reenactment groups. There have how many videos, how many films have there been based on Rome and that got them right, and yet this illustration didn't. The Ransor, they did a pretty good job with the Ransor, and again, that's an obscure weapon, and a relatively obscure weapon, and yet they got it right. Now, the scimitar they had in here, vaguely like the Hassan chop, kind of a hip scimitar, but it doesn't look anything like the actual real-world scimitars, that one-handed weapons that were used in the Middle East. And again, we have lots of versions of that. Go look at Lawrence of Arabia. Good film, good example of what a scimitar looks like. The short bow here, they show is a definite recurve device. Kind of. It's a weird illustration, but it's not what a short bow. It's a standard short bow. It's not a recurve. It's just a single arcing. There's a difference between a recurve, a self bow that it doesn't have a recurve, and a composite bow. Most people don't know what those are. You're going to be doing a chapter on weapons. You should. The short sword kind of looks like a dagger. I thought that was a little on the weird side. And of course, there's the spike chain, which is less absurd than how it is depicted in some games. The star knife in here is, I've done an illustration of a star knife that had 3 blades. This illustration has one that has 4 blades, and I think that the star knife in here would be very dangerous to use. Very dangerous to use. I can't imagine anyone wanting to actually use it properly. They have the temple sword in here. Again, an obscure weapon, and they got it right. So that just, it made no sense to me. The 2-bladed sword, the shaft is way too small. It looks like a 2-bladed dagger, really, seriously. It's not long enough. In fact, I don't even use 2-bladed swords in my games. I use double-ended spears because they make a whole lot more sense. And the last one I'd like to talk about is the Warhammer. The Warhammer in here is Mjolnir. This is the weapon wielded by Odin, or rather by Thor, and only he can lift. A real Warhammer, for realsy, has a head about that long, about that wide, and that thick. It's a small thing on a long shaft, but you get that much metal moving quickly, and it concentrates the energy in an incredibly small spot, which is the goal of damaging the armor being worn by the person. And then the arm, when you hit armor and you dent armor and it's on someone, that dent doesn't go away. It's incredibly dangerous and painful if suddenly you've got armor pressing into your body and now you can't get it out. That's bad for you. Now, I know, you're going to say you're being pedantic, you're going way over the top. Maybe I have. But when you're presenting a book and you're calling it Ultimate Equipment, you should take the effort to do a modicum of research. And you don't have to have the library I've got. I understand that. There are like 5 books you could own that would cover this. You could just do searches online and find a lot of these illustrations, better versions of them, that would help you understand what the item looks like. Now, they look like they were done by all the same guy. And again, he nailed, or she nailed, a lot of the weird stuff. So I can't grasp why they didn't nail the stuff that isn't weird. Now you're going to say, well, they have to live up to the fantasy tropes of the fans. Why? Present the item as it actually looks. They're cool on their own. You don't need to tart them up. Yes, I know. I'm gone on long enough. Well, for those out there who do care about weapon illustrations, they're the ones I made this video for. So everybody else, I suppose I'm going to be listening to all kinds of comments that I have in fact gone off the deep end.